The 9 justices will decide the legality of California's Proposition 8 that bans same-sex marriage. They'll also rule on the constitutionality of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. To help explain the variety of possible outcomes is my guest, Julie Greenberg, law professor at Thomas Jefferson School of Law. Julie, welcome.
Thank you.
Remind us of how Prop 8 ended up in the Supreme Court in the first place.
It got to the Supreme Court because there was a lawsuit brought in the federal court. Once the California Supreme Court upheld Prop 8, then 2 attorneys brought the lawsuit in the federal court, arguing that it violated the U.S. Constitution. 2 provisions, the fundamental right to marry and the Equal Protection Clause.
So what is the key issue for the justice as far as on Prop 8, what they need to vote on?
They need to decide 2 issues. First, do the people who brought the case to the Supreme Court, the proponents of Prop 8, actually have the right or the standing to do that? If they decide yes on that issue, then they have to decide whether Prop 8 violates the U.S. Constitution.
Well, there's several ways this could actually be decided. So let's go through them. Oh, for one, it could be upheld.
For one, it could be upheld. Really, what's easier to go through is to go through, can they actually hear the case? So there's 2 ways they can throw the case out. They can do what's called a dig, or they can say no standing. If they get past those 2, then they can either uphold Prop 8, or they could strike Prop 8 on about 3 different grounds.
Let's talk about those in order. So the dig ruling, meaning that they're deciding not to rule. Is that correct?
They're deciding they should never have agreed to hear the case in the first place, and they need 5 justices to say that.
And then what about as far as striking it down?
As far as any ruling requires 5 justices. So if they get past dig and they get past standing, to strike Prop 8 would take 5 justices, or to uphold Prop 8 would take 5 justices.
So if they struck it down, it would go back to the last ruling, which is it is against the Constitution, a U.S. Constitution, to ban same-sex marriage.
No, if they say no standing, then it goes back to the earlier decisions. If they actually strike Prop 8, then that's the U.S. Supreme Court actually striking it down on their own.
That is the ruling. What is the likelihood? What do you, just your take on this?
So this is a putting myself out on the edge there, because it's so easy to be proven wrong. I think they're not going to get to the merits on Prop 8. I think they will decide it either on a dig or more likely on standing, and they won't get to the merits, which means we go back to the lower court opinions, which means same-sex marriage starts again in California.
Okay. And then the Supreme Court, as we mentioned, is also taking up DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. Now, tell us the key issues with that. So
the key issue in DOMA is not the right to marry, because that's being decided state by state. The key issue in DOMA is if a state gives you the right to marry, will the federal government recognize it? Will they let you file joint tax returns? Will they let you claim Social Security benefits? And so DOMA says the federal government will not give you those rights if you're a same-sex married couple. If they strike DOMA, it means in the states that now allow same-sex couples to marry, all of those couples get their federal rights as well as their state rights.
According to the Constitution, it's constitutional based as well.
Well, they would strike DOMA on constitutional grounds. They would say DOMA violates the Equal Protection Clause.
Exactly. And so what kind of an impact, let's divide these 2 issues up. Let's start with DOMA. What kind of impact would that have? You touched on it briefly. It would basically impact the states that have already decided on same-sex marriage.
Right. Any state that doesn't allow same-sex marriage, this ruling will have 0 effect. It only affects the states that allow same-sex marriages, and in those states, those couples will now get federal rights.
And let's talk about Proposition 8. Could that impact other states as well besides California?
Technically, the court could issue a sweeping ruling that would affect the country. I think the chances of that are very close to 0 that they would do that. I think they're going to make if they get to the merits, they will make a very narrow ruling that applies only to California, is my prediction.
Just to California. So we're waiting on pins and needles for this. When is it likely that we'll hear from the justices?
Well, we're going to hear sometime before the end of June. Whether it's next week or the last week of June, they haven't given us any hint at all.
All right. But they're likely to come down on the same day, do you think, or they'll?
I think it would be unusual for them not to. There's many of the arguments overlap, and so I can't see a reason why the Supreme Court would not issue the rulings on the same day.
All righty then. Law professor Julie Greenberg, thanks so much for this update.
It was my pleasure.